Welcome back. Had a good lunch? Enjoyed this morning? All going well? That's fine, we're only halfway through. I'd like to introduce, my pleasure to introduce, Mike Tipton. He told me not to say too much. Mike Tipton from Portsmouth University. And there we go. But to save him being too humble, Mike is the go-to man for governments, rescue organisations around the world. He is probably the world's leading authority on what happens to your body when you put it in cold water. Okay? So you will almost certainly find out some interesting things. How many people here have fallen in? Yeah, those of you who didn't put your hand up, it's just a matter of time. That's what fish farming is all about. Mike, thank you.
So, thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to come and speak here. So, really nice to come and see this beautiful part of the world. And
there's one seat here, folks.
And yeah, just file in and find somewhere. Pull the chairs up. So, as you've heard, I'm just going to give you a quick review of cold water immersion and some of the associated things around it. So that's the Titanic, and that's where the story begins for us, in that the consequences of that disaster were that people became obsessed with hypothermia, or a fall in deep body temperature, and that's what people died from. So if you read in the newspaper, you'd read, oh, they died from hypothermia in 4 minutes. You still see those kind of headlines today. It's a physical impossibility to die from hypothermia if you're an adult human being in less than 30 minutes. It doesn't matter whether you're naked in iced water, which I don't suppose you are very often, but if you were, you're not going to become hypothermic. And we know from statistical, anecdotal, and experimental evidence that lots of other things are happening. And my dear friend and colleague Frank Golden, some years ago now, identified these 4 stages associated with particular risk, and I'm going to run you through them in the next half an hour and give you some examples. And just make a note, because I think probably in sea fishing you're much more likely to have a short period of immersion than a longer period of immersion. Unfortunately, it's in that short period of immersion where most people die. About 60% die here, about 20% here, and then we'll talk a bit about this, because I know we've got a mixed audience. We've got some people involved in search and rescue as well that are here. So really these risks are associated with what you call, that's skin cooling, that's superficial nerves and muscles, that's deep tissue, there's hypothermia appearing for the first time. And then this is quite an interesting area that's worthy of a lecture on its own, but we'll just touch on it in case you ever have to help somebody out for water. So you know when you're doing a slightly dodgy experiment when you replace your medical officer with a priest. And you tie them to a Christmas tree for safety. We can do better than that, and we do. And if you, this is a medical student wishing he'd done art or something that didn't involve him sitting above 20,000 litres of 10-degree water. And if you just lower him down to the neck, there's the response you'll get. You'll have heard it called, we first called it cold shock back in the 80s. And I just mention it now. Here we are. Just enjoy that for a moment. That's my wife, tell her I'll be home in about an hour. So this is pre-immersion. So this guy is he's young and fit and healthy, and he's a little bit excited. He's 96 beats per minute heart rate. He knows that that's about to happen because he saw the previous guy go in. So that was a mistake on our part, but it doesn't matter. This is somebody sitting absolutely still, just breathing away at 66 breaths per minute, heart rate 156 beats per minute. He's hyperventilating. That is uncontrollable. That's cold shock. And it's driven by the cold receptors in the skin, as I mentioned before. The interesting thing to know, although this is pretty bad, within 5 minutes you've settled down, and that's really important to know, because if you know that, you do the right things, and your chances of getting through that first couple of minutes are much improved, as we'll talk about later. So let's have a little look at that. So this was an experiment we did some years ago. Actually, it was for the oil industry, and this is a mock-up of a Bell 212 helicopter. That's a mock-up of a Bell 212 helicopter, and that's a maximum breath hold time. And this was actually, the reason I show it, it's quite a historic piece of video, because you can see this guy hyperventilating away now. And then he's going to make an exit, but unfortunately somewhat later. He had to sit there for the time it takes to empty a Bell 212 helicopter, which is about 40 seconds. This was the shuttle jacket that some of you may remember was provided in those days, because it provided protection against hypothermia, preoccupied with hypothermia. How much time did it give you underwater? Give you 1 extra second breath hold time. And it was on the basis of this video that all those flying offshore were provided with an emergency breathing system, what's called Air Pocket. They've now gone on to a mini scooter, so we developed the Air Pocket. It's basically an empty plastic bag, but don't tell anyone because they charge about 450 quid for each empty plastic bag. I don't get any, as you can tell, I don't get any of the money. So that's the fact of it. You've got a maximum breath hold time of about 5 seconds if you're underwater there, about 10 degrees. The cold shock response, it peaks between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius, somewhere in there. Our average water temperature around the British Isles is about 12. So next time this is why I can't watch Titanic, because when Kate Winslet goes under the 0 degree water, she holds her breath for 35 seconds. I've timed it, that's how sad I am. No, so don't watch Titanic. It's wrong. So here's that pre-immersion, first minute of immersion. You've seen the graph, we don't need to concentrate on this too much. 5th minute of immersion, settling down. So this number here, this breathing volume, 114 litres per minute. The lethal dose of water in the lung for drowning, seawater, is about 1.5 litres. So the gasp response that you get when you go in is about 2 litres. So you've already crossed the lethal dose for drowning on that first big gasp in. Fresh water is a bit more, it's about 3 litres, but that's 2 breaths. So it's a dangerous response. The water doesn't like to get, the lung doesn't like to get water into it. There's drowning, takes about 2 minutes. You continue to breathe for about the first 70 seconds, and the heart will keep going for about 2 minutes. That's quite important, because I'll come back to that in a moment, but just remember that 2 minutes. And there's somebody who has aspirated some water. You can see the X-ray, there's some water in the lung. But before you aspirate the water, you swallow. Now, people don't do that deliberately, but if you're underwater and you think you're going to have to breathe in, the first thing to do is swallow, because that's what people do, because it's better off having the water in the stomach than it going into the lung. It's not a conscious decision, it's just what people do. So this is a big, full stomach of water. And of course the problem with that is you get somebody out and they haven't crossed the lethal dose for drowning, so they're salvageable. Then you start doing CPR, you start doing what you're doing, and they vomit up the water from their stomach, and then it goes down into their lung and they cross the lethal dose. So you have to be very careful if you're involved in the rescue and resuscitation of somebody, that you don't allow them drown in the water they brought out of the water with them. How long, okay, so drowning, you're in cardiorespiratory arrest in 2 minutes. How long can you go and be resuscitated for? On average, it's about 10 minutes. If you've got about a 10-minute window with a good opportunity of getting that person back, even though they've stopped breathing, the heart stopped at about 2 minutes, you can get to them and start doing something reasonable within 10 minutes, then the chances are pretty good. They fall away to just about nothing by about 25 minutes. Do you have to treat saltwater and freshwater drowning? No, you don't. Differently, you don't. They're the same thing. In terms of your chances of resuscitating somebody, they're the same thing. For different reasons, it doesn't matter about those different reasons, but essentially that person is suffocating. They've either got saltwater sitting in the lung, stopping any air, aerating the blood, or they've got fresh water that's gone into the lung, gone across the lung into the bloodstream, and the lungs have collapsed. It doesn't really matter. They're suffering from hypoxia, decreased oxygen, increased CO2, and they're becoming acidotic as a result, i.e. they're asphyxiating. As a consequence of which, the first thing you need to try and do is get some oxygen into them. There's lots of other things you can do, but the relief of oxygen, the relief of the hypoxia by the provision of oxygen, is the #1 influence on the outcome. So the speed is greatest influence on outcome. Every minute CPR delayed, 10% less chance of success. Get them intubated, give them a high inspired oxygen and some positive inspiratory pressure. But the most important thing is get oxygen into them as soon as you can. And that underlines why when you look at cardiac arrest of the heart, you actually include breaths. Because the person has gone, their heart has stopped because they've suffocated. They've got no oxygen left in the body, so you need to add breaths to the chest compression. Nowadays, when it's a normal primary cardiac arrest, because there's quite a lot of oxygen still left in the body, we only do basic life support compressions only. But that's because when the heart stops here, it's stopping because of a heart problem with lots of oxygen in the body. Here, the heart is stopping because you've suffocated, i.e. little oxygen in the body, therefore you add some breaths to the compression. Okay, let's see if we can... So I've told you loads of ways of dying. Let's see if we can find a way of staying alive.
It started as a sled ride along the ice-coated rock on the shore of Lake Michigan in Wilson. A slip, and 35-year-old Terrence Totlowitz of 3818 West Montrose and his 4-year-old son James were suddenly in the near freezing water. A cross-country skier had seen the incident and had come to help, but he could not hoist the man up the 6-foot rock wall. The child, meanwhile, had disappeared under the ice. The fire department arrived with ladders and desperately needed manpower, and the man was hauled up, out, and to a waiting ambulance.
That's 5 or 10 minutes in ice-cold water.
That left a child somewhere in the murky, ice-clogged water. By helicopter and special van, fire department scuba divers sped to the scene, wasting little time in donning rubber suits and air tanks. But time was running out. The child had already been under the water for more than 15 minutes. Time after time, the divers surfaced. Nothing, they shouted. But then, 5 minutes after they entered the water, the divers nodded. Success unassumed. Child had been underwater about a half an hour, and we had thought there could be no hope for the boy's survival. But he lived, though it would be a critical case for some time to come.
Current record for submersion with full recovery is 66 minutes. Nearly always children or small adults. And the secret to it is very fast cooling. So remember that drowning process that I said takes 2 minutes? If you happen to be taking ice cold water in and out of the lung, that cools the heart, that cools the blood supply to the brain whilst it keeps going for that 2 minutes, that cools the brain. If you can get the brain down from 37 degrees to 30, then you've doubled the time it can go without oxygen. So it goes from about 10 minutes to about 20 minutes. In that time you start cooling from the surface. If you get the brain temperature down to 20, you've got about an hour. Did anyone see the documentary or the film, The Last Breath of the diver, yeah? Okay, so exactly the same mechanism. They don't know, they say in the film they don't know how it happens. We know how it happens. It happens here with ice cold water going into the lung, cooling the heart, cooling the brain before the breathing and the circulation stop. In that situation, the loss of heating to the breathing gas, because of the density of that gas, is like having water going out in and out of the lung. So he would have cooled really significantly when he lost that hot water supply and the heated breathing gas. And it's that mechanism, exactly the same mechanism, which has protected for that period. If you haven't seen that, it's a fascinating film, isn't it? It's kind of interesting to see. So the advice for those involved in search and rescue is that we know that 6 degree water is a kind of magic number. Above that, maximum underwater survival time that we've recorded has been about 20 minutes with recovery. Once it gets below 6 degrees, it goes up to that record of 66 minutes. So if you add a bit of a safety factor in, Yes, the water is colder than the 6 degrees, then you've got about 90 minutes. If it's warmer than 6 degrees, you've got about 30 minutes in terms of the likelihood of resuscitation. What about protection? Well, the speed with which you go into the water makes a difference, because it's receptors just 0.18 millimetres below the surface of the skin. So fat doesn't protect against this response. Although fat people tend to be a bit more buoyant, so their airway will be a bit clearer, but you don't want to rely on that really. So the faster the skin temperature changes, and the more it changes, the bigger the response. So your obvious one is don't fall in. Have lots of procedures in place to stop you falling in. We've talked a bit about underwater breathing devices, not really appropriate in your situation. Unfortunately, the speed you go in the water is more determined by gravity than personal preference. We'll talk a bit about that. The fitter you are, the smaller that cold shock response. Protective clothing, we'll talk a bit about that. You've heard quite a lot about life jackets, and of course they help keep the airway clear of the water. Let's have a look at protective clothing. This is your respiratory frequency, how many times you're breathing. And the more you breathe, the more chance you'll aspirate the water, and you need to be able to hold your breath. Here's the first minute of immersion. It's an old slide back in 1990. This is somebody in swimming trunks. This is somebody wearing just normal clothing and foul weather clothing. So oilskins, foul weather clothing are not that much better than conventional clothing, because they still let water flood in and under the clothing and change the skin temperature. If you want to get full protection against the cold shock response, then you need to go down a dry suit route, but of course there are other things that you need to balance against that. So 2 of the 3 members of this family think that repeated immersions in cold water are good for you. This guy's not so sure. Particularly if mum seems to be holding on to some kind of power lead and dad's in flip-flops. Another health and safety nightmare. But of course, as always, mum and dad are right. If you do repeated exposures to cold water, then you see a decrease, very significant decrease in the ventilatory response, you regain control of your breathing, and a decrease in the heart rate response. Now this response is going to result in drowning. This response is going to be the thing that gives you your heart attack in the first minute or 2 of immersion. So both of these are valuable. So as few as 5, 6, 2 or 3 minute immersions in cold water will halve the cold shock response. 14 months later, that response will still be reduced by 25%. We've never managed to get anybody to come back for more than 14 months. We lost our friends by then. Let's go back to this. This is quite an interesting slide. This is for those that are involved with the RLI, good on you, this underpins all of the Respect the Water campaign. So we work closely with the RLI. This underpins the Respect the Water campaign since its initiation in 2014. So there's that response with people before they go in. There's the cold shock response. So this was, respect the water, understand what's going to happen to you. And you can't underestimate the importance of knowing that the cold shock response is going to come, but it's going to go away. Because if you can do the right thing for that first minute, minute and a half, until you get your breathing back under control, you've got a much better chance of surviving. People tend to go into the water, they get activated, they start thrashing about, they start swimming hard, they start moving. But actually it's completely the wrong thing to do. It's a natural thing to do because your body's being activated, it's fight or flight response. But you've got to fight that instinct, and if you can just float, stay still, hold on to something until you get your breathing back under control, we know you have a much better chance of surviving. So hence, the fight your instincts aspect of the Respect the Water. I mention this because everywhere I go in Lerwick, there's one of these on a rubbish bin. So it's at the forefront of my mind at the moment. It's great, the amount of coverage it's getting. And float to live. And if you haven't seen this advert, then I will be surprised.
Everyone who falls into cold water has the same instinct, to swim hard. The cold water shock can make them gasp uncontrollably and breathe in water. Then they drown. But if they just float until the cold water shock has passed, then they'll have a far better chance of staying alive.
Really interesting to be a scientist and take one graph and then work with people who produce adverts like that, which is, I think, amazing. So we add to that list of things that you can do to protect against cold shock don't swim immediately, float first, rest and recover, get yourself back under control. And it's much less likely that you'll drown, and it's also much less stress on the heart as well in that first minute. Okay, let's look at the short-term responses. So now you're in the water, you've been in the water a couple of minutes, you've survived the cold shock response, no heart problem, no drowning problem. Your next problem is that as the skin cools, then the superficial nerves and muscles will start to cool next. Those superficial nerves and muscles are particularly in the limbs, so you lose the ability to do stuff. And you've got between 10 and 20 minutes in the coldest kind of water to be able to do something. So classically you'll see it in this kind of scenario. That's back in 1942, 66 years later, I can show you exactly the same slide. Things don't change, they just get in colour, really. So the reasons for that we know physiologically. I won't bore you with the list, but there's a whole host of things that cooling does. But particularly, it does things to the nerves and muscle, the function of nerves and muscles. And the magic temperature is about 27 degrees. Once your muscle temperature gets below that, to that level, you are physically incapacitated. I'll show you what that means in a moment. How long does that take? This is the magic 27 degrees. This is deep muscle temperature. This is a needle thermistor that we put into the forearm of the muscle. You push it into the forearm by 2 or 3 centimetres. And we know that it takes about 20 minutes if the water is at 12 degrees. It takes about 40 minutes if the water is at 20. If it's down at about 5, it takes about 10 minutes. So you've got 10, 20 minutes in the kind of temperatures that you'd experience up here of useful dexterity and hand function. And this is what it looks like when it goes wrong. So this is a Royal Marine. He's been in the water 20 minutes. His grip strength here is halved. This is an old video. Plus we've been out drinking before we did the experiment, so the cameraman's not right on it. Not true. So now he's given a flare to undo. He can do this in 10 seconds. But 20 minutes after being in water at 12 degrees Celsius, his forearm muscles and his nerves in the forearms have reached that magic temperature, and off he goes. Now, he's trying to do this sitting on a chair in a tank of cold water. Imagine trying to do this bouncing around in the North Sea. So he's lost the ability to oppose finger and thumb. He's lost his grip strength. He's lost his speed of movement. The other thing that happens, for those of you, if you come in from the displays outside, plastic changes its physical characteristics when it gets cold and wet. It becomes harder to tear, it becomes slippery. And so it's really important that if you've got kit, you try and use it, if you're developing it, in the situation in which it's going to be used. And you practice using it in those situations. This goes on for some time. This wouldn't have happened. In fact, he's now switched to trying to bite the topo. So when you look at the fatal accident inquiries, the Estonia and ferry disasters, they found teeth in the life rafts where people were trying to break into the balers through the plastic. Exactly the same problem, beautifully demonstrated here. It was about now he wanted to know the name and address of the guy who developed the packaging. So he and a few of his Marines colleagues have gone and paid him a short visit. It took 10 years. That's how long it takes to change things. It took 10 years to get a serrated top to that plastic cover. Because people just don't think about the real situation. There are life rafts where the Velcro that shuts the life raft down overlaps by that much. You go out there and try and do that on the daylight today. So practice, buy stuff that's going to work in the real situation. He'd never actually, it's a dummy flare, but he actually never managed to turn it and push it in. But we couldn't make him do it again because of this look right at the end. Pulling it out now. Bless him. Okay, let's go on to long term. Now, I don't think that there's much chance of people in the fishing industry of the kind that you're doing, this sort of sea fishing, salmon fishing, spending an enormous amount of time in the water. But it's worth mentioning this in terms of search and rescue in particular. So now for the first time, we enter the realm where hypothermia can be a problem. And there's the signs and symptoms of hypothermia. I'm not going to spend too much time on. The first major organ to be affected is the brain, and people forget. They forget what they were told to do, they forget all their training, they then slip into semi-consciousness and unconsciousness. And around about a deep body temperature of 30 from a normal one of 37, your pupils dilate, your tendon reflexes are absent, and it's really easy to be mistaken for dead because your breathing's very low, your heart rate may be 4 or 5 beats per minute. And then around about that magic temperature of 27, 28, the heart, which is just another muscle, starts to have problems, and death, failure to revive at around about 25. There's no time on here because the speed with which you come down that slope varies very significantly. If I took everybody in this room and stuck you into 10-degree water, the rates of cooling would be really very different. We'd have some fast coolers and some slow coolers. So there's water temperature, 10 degrees, the fast cooler is going to be hypothermic and death highly probable within about an hour and a half, a slow cooler about 5 hours. So you can see for those involved in search and rescue how difficult it is to make an estimation of survival time. The current curves that are used by the Coast Guard came from our work, which was this, where we looked using the UK National Immersion Incident Survey of the top survivors across the temperature band. This is maximum upper observed survival time. If you then smooth those curves, you come up with this line here, which has that formula. You don't need to worry about that, other than to know, those of you who are involved in search and rescue, that's the line that you use currently in terms of your search and rescue parameters. Now, the point to make about that, and it's a point which we're making pretty much all the time when we talk to the Coast Guard when they give us a call about likely survival times, is remember that's the maximum. That's the best case scenario across that board. If, for example, I had a call the other day, a Filipino fisherman wearing boiler suit in a Force 8, 12-degree water, that's going to be way too long in terms of, sadly, that gentleman's survival time. So you have to modify that. This is the best case scenario. And what can change the rate at which you call? There's a whole host of factors that's going to determine how quickly you call. So let's have a look at a couple of them. There's one, what you wear. I've already mentioned a dry suit. There's a standard dry suit used in the oil industry. It's got no insulation in it other than what you wear normally, but it's got wrist seals and a neck seal. And it stops you getting wet and preserves the insulation of the clothing underneath. If you happen to work in the Norwegian sector, where it's much colder, below zero sometimes, then you have to wear an insulated suit. So what? Well, here's water temperature, here's survival time. There's a thin person wearing normal clothing. There's their survival curve. There's a thin person wearing one of these. This is an RAF graph, and it preceded political correctness, so they've labelled it fat and thin. But there is a fatter person wearing normal clothing. There is a fat person wearing one of those. Here is a thin person wearing one of those, and here is a fat person. Now this person is going to starve before they get cold. I'm not worried about that. That's like they've missed 3 or 4 meals. So just be aware, going back to the flare thing, I think it's quite important to make a note of the fact that when you look at a piece of kit and you see all the blurb that comes with it, it's likely that it's been tested in this kind of situation. You're likely to need to use it in that kind of situation. So just be aware of that. And the other thing that you'll see is you'll always see things tested that are absolutely brand new. When you get to wear it, it could be the last day it's going to be in service. So just keep all of these things in mind in terms of assessing the quality and the appropriateness of what you're providing. I'll just mention life jackets because you've had excellent presentations on that. We did some work with the, again, the UK National Immersion Incident Survey up there, looking at the value of a life jacket. And you can just forget the times really, but this is survival probability without a life jacket against with it. And the difference in those lines tells you everything you need to know. Wear a life jacket. Wear a life jacket with a light, and wear a life jacket with a strap. So these are some tests done in the RNI pooling, swimming pool, survival pool. That's a dummy without the strap on after 3 hours. This was based on an event that occurred, the Uzo disaster in Solent, and the next one you'll see is the same time with a got that. You can shortcut that by looking at that. Therein lies your problem. People are drowning by falling through their life jackets unless they're wearing some kind of life jacket retention system like a crotch strap. The last one I'm going to mention is motion sickness. And I have to mention that because I come from Portsmouth. And I have to show a picture of Nelson in every presentation I do. Nelson suffered from motion illness, seasickness, the whole of his life. Never managed to overcome it. Lawrence of Arabia suffered from camel sickness. Always got sick when riding a camel. And something to do tonight. If you take goldfish in a bowl and you put it on the back seat of your car and you drive it about, it gets car sick, it will vomit. Don't ask me how I know that. Interesting, isn't it? So I did some work with a guy called Igor Mekovich. In fact, I spent a long while looking around the planet for a guy called Igor to work in the lab with. So it's always my ambition to shout "more power, Igor" across the laboratory. And this is blessing. This is Igor actually flicking a power switch, fulfilling my. I can't remember what study we were doing, but that's the end of it. I remember. There's a guy in here. We're doing some nasty things to, but that was the most important. So we're looking there at motion illness. So we did a study where we made people sick by putting them into a human centrifuge. It was funded by the Swedish Air Force, so they were quite keen that we use their centrifuge. So if you sit in a human centrifuge and you get spun round, and it accelerates and it slows down, it accelerates and it slows down, and whilst it's accelerating and slowing down, you do this with your head, it makes you feel really sick. You think you're going to get away with it. You're doing this 20 times, and by 3 you think, well, that's okay, this is a piece of cake. I'm not going to have a problem here. By about 10, you don't feel so good. Now, I don't normally show this to people, but I just know you're going to, you're the kind of people who won't take it any further. No more cameras. This was my go at it. Now, before we get started, you need to know the scoring system. If you could say 1 is okay, 2 is slightly nauseous, 3 is moderately nauseous. Now, when people got to moderately nauseous, we took them out of the centrifuge and we put them into cold water to see how quickly they would cool. Because nobody, all the fatal accident inquiries, it was the person who got seasick who died. And nobody really bothered investigating why. We wanted to avoid very nauseous. We have to just supplement with this with knowing I'm reasonably competitive.
What's your vote?
2.9.
2.9. Should we? You want to do another one or?
Yeah, one more.
Okay. Vision still okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so the last one, I think you're looking a bit sick here. Look down, look up, look left, look right, and straight ahead. Okay. What's your vote?
3.
There's some conversation there that we can't publicly broadcast.
Sweating. All right. We'll do the gradual onset now. If you.
Hang on a second.
We know.
That's the talk. Okay. So at that point you get put in cold water, which is not a great thing to do afterwards. But what you find is that once people get motion sick, this is people in the centrifuge without moving their head. This is people just going into cold without going in the centrifuge. This one is with the head in. So these are the sick people. And this is a measure of how much you shut down into the cold water. And what happens when you get motion ill is the blood keeps flowing to your skin and you lose heat really quickly. So you don't vasoconstrict, shut down the blood flow to the skin. So the problem with motion illness is you cool more quickly. Okay, finally, this is what we call circumrescue collapse. So this is people dying. It's about one in 5 people dying at the point of rescue. And some of them before rescue, during rescue, some post-rescue. Post-rescue often is just the delayed effects of drowning. We've talked about that being a process that starts and continues afterwards. We'll talk a bit about during rescue. This one is kind of interesting because there's now so much evidence from the search and rescue community that a number of people, you come to them and at the point of being rescued, their condition deteriorates to the point of death in some cases. And we think we know why it happens. We can't do any studies on this because, of course, you're in a safe situation when you're in an experiment. We think it's people's relief at the prospect of being rescued, in that they kind of go, oh, and with that, they get a collapse in their blood pressure, which leads to a problem. And you can make that worse if you start saying things to them like, you're safe, we've got you, you've made it. At that point, because that relief will be heightened. Now you can't say the opposite. You can't say, we're not rescuing you, you've got to stay there, blah, 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 blah. So but there is a compromise where you can say, we're here to help you, but keep fighting for your survival. We need you to keep, because you haven't really survived an immersion incident until you walk out of the hospital. These are interesting. Excuse me, these are interesting. This is people who are perfectly okay in the water, and then as you start to take them out of the water, they collapse, they have a collapse in blood pressure. Originally thought to be a continued cooling, led to lots of rather infamous work at the Dachau concentration camp around the Second World War. But when you're in the water, you're being squeezed by the water, and that's helping your heart, because it's helping blood get pushed back to the heart, which helps your cardiac output. So actually being immersed in cold water is a bit like wearing anti-G trousers. It's squeezing blood back up to the heart and helping the heart perform. And what do? We come along and we lift people out of the water. And it may well be that squeeze that was the one thing that was keeping their heart at a functional level. And we take that away. And as a consequence of which, all of these things happen. You lose that hydrostatic squeeze, you reimpose gravity, you've lost some fluid when you're in the water because you get a cold-induced diuresis. You'll know that anybody who's stood watching a football match or stood at a bus queue in the cold all of a sudden needs to go for a pee. That's cold-induced diuresis. Your blood viscosity is up, you've got a cold heart. There's lots of reasons why you're in a bad state, and then you come and lift people up. And so the thing to do when you lift them out of the water is try and keep them horizontal. And that's why we have things like Jason's cradle. But remember, these are people who have been in the water at least 30 minutes. These are people who are hypothermic. You don't need to do this if it's just somebody who's just fallen in. If they've just fallen in, the major threat to them is that they're going to take water into the lung or they're going to have a heart attack. So if you need to, pull them up by the nostrils, by the ears, by anything you can get 2 fingers into, get them up, because it's a much safer thing to do. And then once you put them in your fast rescue craft or your helicopter, which way round should you have them? Well, I apologise, I make my own slides, but this is a fast rescue craft, and the fast rescue craft goes like that when it moves. Now, I tell you the importance of applied physiology and science is that we found that people were saying, well, when we rescued the guy okay, but as soon as we set off for home, he collapsed. I said, well, where did you have the head? Well, we have the head here. Well, of course, as soon as you do that, you're putting a strain on the cardiovascular system. So put the head to the back, because when you do that, you'll help blood flow back to the heart. It's as simple as that. If you know what the problem is, you can sort it out. What about in a helicopter? Well, in a helicopter, you put them the other way around, because when a helicopter starts off, it flies like that. So you put the head to the front to help the blood flow back to the heart. That simple piece of information has eradicated that problem with fast rescue craft and helicopters. And finally, you've got them out of water. What do you put around them? You can spend quite a lot of money on aluminium foil blankets, but my recommendation is you get an old rubble sack, because the major problem in this situation is you're losing heat by evaporation. And if you lose heat by evaporation, you can lose a lot of heat. If you put a plastic bag over somebody, obviously not the head, but if you put a plastic bag over somebody, then all you've got to do is warm the water up from 4 degrees, which is the water, to skin temperature, which is 33 degrees. That is going to result in about a ½ degree fall in deep body temperature. If, however, you leave somebody without a plastic bag wrapped around it, then all that water will evaporate and you'll end up with a 10-degree fall in deep body temperature. So the simple expedient of taking with you a large plastic rubble sack, which costs about £1, can make a difference of half a degree to a 10-degree fall in deep body temperature. I'll show you my favourite experiment, my final slide, my favourite experiment emphasising the importance of evaporation and how much heat you can lose by evaporation. So this was a study that was done some years ago before ethics committees, and it's a dramatic illustration of the cooling effects of evaporation of sweat in this case, but it could just as easily be water in clothing. In an experiment by Blagden, 1775, in which men remained for a period of 15 minutes in the dry atmosphere of an oven at 120 degrees Celsius without suffering ill effects, while a steak on an adjacent shelf in the oven was cooked. Steaks don't sweat, steaks can't lose heat by the evaporation of sweat. Humans do. Great experiment, ends up with lunch. If you ask students what the most important word in that paragraph is, they always say steak. It's actually dry because it was a dry atmosphere, so the sweat could evaporate. So we've been through a lot of ground, and I've deliberately left 10 minutes for questions. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you. Any questions, comments, additional information? I've told you pretty much everything I know, so don't be too...
Mark, we spoke before when I met you.
Yeah.
We spoke about different layers and different attitudes towards air temperature and sea temperature. And you were explaining that multiple layers, which is what we would wear in air temperature, wasn't a good thing in the sea, and you just wanted one thick layer. Could you expand on that a little bit for the guys?
I vaguely remember that conversation. Yes, so certainly in cold air, it's generally known that the more you do it by layers, because then you can adjust your layers depending on how much activity you're engaged in. Most people who are in cold environments, working in cold environments, complain because of physical activity that they spend more time too hot than they do too cold. And the problem with doing that is once you put sweat into the clothing, you destroy the insulation. Now, with cold water, the major thing you need to do is to try and keep the cold water from the skin. So just a dry coverall will do that. But you've got to have it over some insulation. But in that situation, the number of layers you have is kind of irrelevant because you're not going to be exercising particularly. You'll be shivering, but you're not going to be generating enough heat to start sweating. You're not going to be able to adjust the insulation you've got. So provided you've got enough insulation under a dry suit, then it doesn't really matter how it's provided. And most people in the oil industry, those who've been involved in the oil industry, will know that there's a recommendation of what you float: vest, shirt, pullover, dry suit. So, but it's much more critical in cold air that you adjust your insulation so that you don't get too hot. The best way to stay warm is to stay slightly cool in a cold environment.
I have that question. So post-recovery or post-rescue, if we manage to get someone out from an immersion incident within the 10-minute period, and we'll put them in the bubble sack, TPA, whatever, for how long do they have to remain in that, and what other actions should we be taking with regards to keeping them in a horizontal position or heating them up or whatever?
Yeah. So the general recommendation, I mean, these are certainly a little bit circumstance specific, of course, but the general recommendation is you get somebody out, you get rescue breaths or oxygen into them as quickly as possible. So as soon as you can, start a CPR. Try and keep them, as I say, horizontal, but at the same time trying to evacuate, getting into a place where they can get advanced medical care as soon as possible. Now, even if somebody appears otherwise normal, but you suspect that they may have aspirated water, then you do the same thing. You get them to advanced medical care as soon as you can. Because we know that drowning is a process. It used to be called secondary drowning, but they've got rid of that term. But we know that's a process where if there's any indication that these people have had compromised lung function, then that can deteriorate into something which is untreatable fairly quickly. So Does that, rather than talk to you more about specific circumstances?
Yeah.
But the number one thing, if you suspect drowning, drowning is your major problem, way ahead of anything to do with hypothermia. Drowning and cardiac arrest are your major problems. So that it's CPR, which is the indicated initial response. And if you've got an additional oxygen, you can get a high oxygen in, you can give positive expiratory and expiratory pressure. All of that is indicated. But you know, at the same time you're organising the evacuation to get this person to advanced medical care.